So for my Frankenstein adaptation, I decided to scroll through Wikipedia and see which Frankenstein movie stuck out to me most. The one that I chose, which I will tell you later, I chose because it fit two criteria that make for a good adaptation. That movie is The Bride of Frankenstein, 1935 movie, which follows the 1931 original Frankenstein. And the purpose of this movie is to tell the story of what happens when Frankenstein decides to create the female monster. So what makes for a good adaptation? The first criteria would be that of faithfulness to the characters and the plot. And that's not to say that it has to be 100% faithful. In fact, you don't want it to be 100% faithful, but you want it to be recognizable as an adaptation of the original. The second criteria would be that of context with purpose and context of the time period. You want a movie that's going to be created for the 1935 audience and not for Mary Shelley's original intended 1818 audience. So with reference to faithfulness to the characters, we have a new one, and her name is the Bride, and you can imagine why she is important to this movie. She is created specifically for this adaptation, and that's why she's not faithful to the original, but she is important. The monster was in the original book, but he was in a much more vicious and intelligent form than in the movie. And he has some qualities that are faithful to the original, so he's kind of faithful, kind of not, but his differences are important. Frankenstein was a support character in the movie, whereas he was the main character in the original, and he also evokes pity from the audience in the movie, which is why he is not faithful, but an interesting character. Dr. Pretorius is a new character, so he's not faithful to the original in that sense, but he is necessary because we all know that Frankenstein was not going to create the female monster. So Dr. P acts as a catalyst who forces Frankenstein to make the monster. So none of these characters are ever completely faithful, but their unfaithfulness is purposeful, and the parts of them that are faithful make it recognizable as an adaptation of Frankenstein, and for that reason, it is a good adaptation. So yay! So with reference to faithfulness to the plot, in the beginning of the movie, the monster has a lot of human interaction, especially with villagers, which does not happen in the original book, and that makes for a much more interesting storyline. In the middle, the monster has a lot of interaction with the blind man, which we know in the original book, he really just watches the blind man and his family from afar, but again, that would make a very dull storyline that nobody would want to watch, so it is a necessary unfaithfulness. The end is vastly different from the beginning. Not from the beginning, from the original book. And the ending in the movie is actually a very happy ending, whereas in the book it is a not very happy ending. So none of this plot is very faithful whatsoever, but it's a good thing because if it was a very faithful plot, it would make for a very boring movie, and so the directors just pick and chose what would make it interesting, and that made for a good adaptation. The second criteria is purpose with reference to the time period, and the 1935 Bride of Frankenstein adapts to the time, which was the Great Depression, so that gives you a bit of context of what was going on around then. Like I mentioned before, this movie is also a sequel to the 1931 movie Frankenstein, and that ties into the purpose because a large reason for the making of this movie is to appease the original audience by making a sequel for that movie. So based on the context of the Great Depression and the time in the original, the purpose of Bride of Frankenstein is to explore a whole new world of Frankenstein that nobody has ever really touched on before, and that fits the demand of the time. So based on the second criteria, it is safe to say that this movie was updated for the time, for the 1935 audience, not made for an 1818 audience, and that makes it a good adaptation because it's relevant. So fun facts, Colin Clive was actually, he plays Frankenstein. He was actually a raging alcoholic during the filming of this movie, and a lot of people wanted to recast him, but the director said they wanted to keep him because it makes for a good Frankenstein qualities. So the impact of this movie is that from 1935 all the way to today, it is largely considered one of the greatest movies of all time, and that prolongs the relevance of the original book Frankenstein. So in conclusion, based on the two criteria that I previously set, the Bride of Frankenstein fulfills those two criteria, and that makes for a timeless movie reference that brings value to the original book, and for that reason is a great adaptation.